All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Laura Casney. I will be hosting the event today. And then we also have Rita Thomas. She will be moderating. I am a conservation director serving Southeast Nebraska for the AmeriCorps Common Ground program. The Common Ground program holds educational webinars and events about conservation issues such as water quality, clean energy, and soil health. We focus on educating the public and preserving Nebraska's natural legacy. A couple of items before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those in the Q&A option below. We aren't able to see or hear you, so that's the best way for us to get any questions to Peter tonight. There is going to be a question segment after our presentation, and during that time, you'll be asked to fill out a 3-question survey regarding this event. We would love for you to complete the survey as it helps us measure our outreach and is used for grant reporting purposes, so we can continue doing events like these. So today we are joined by Peter M. Brown. He is the founder and director of the nonprofit Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research in Colorado. He is going to be discussing the use of tree rings in research and how this research can be utilized. So Peter, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Rita, in particular for the invitation to talk to the group tonight. Yeah, I'm the director. As Laura mentioned, I have my own nonprofit organization, Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research, but I'm also affiliate faculty at Colorado State University. I teach courses in fire ecology and forest ecology. Occasionally, I teach courses in tree ring research as well when students are doing some sort of tree ring project for a thesis or a dissertation and so on. So tonight, just to give you a little introduction to tree ring research, and then also most of my research is actually involved in looking at past fires. Tree rings can be used for both looking at, for example, climate. I'll give some examples of some of the applications, but also ecological processes. Basically, the idea is that, any nice thing about trees is they never move in their lifetime. They're always in one spot. So any of the climate or environmental factors, fire, et cetera, can potentially be recorded in the tree ring series. So, definitely, if you've got any questions, I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly, hopefully. Well, I can get my slides to advance. There we go. So most everybody probably knows, you can count the tree rings and find the age of the tree and so on. In this case, these are a set of tree rings from ponderosa pine. Of course, ponderosa pine is native there to Nebraska, the Pine Bluff area. Also the Niobrara River. We've done some sampling along the Niobrara, and there's, for climate studies, one thing I want you to notice in the tree rings here, so there's the light part of the ring and the dark part of the ring. This is a ponderosa pine series of ponderosa pine tree rings. Each of those, early wood is the light colored part, and then late wood is the dark colored part. Both of those equal to one ring, one annual ring. The trees are only growing in the summertime. They don't grow in the wintertime. So we have these annual layers put on during the growing season. One quick thing to notice is that there's actually quite a bit of variation in the ring patterns, the ring widths. This, of course, controlled by climate. I'll get to this in a minute in terms of our cross dating, but one thing we can do with tree rings is look at past climate from how fast the trees were growing. Now those 3 dots, one thing is, to be a good dendrochronologist, you really just have to know how to count backwards from 10. We put a dot on every decade, 3 dots at every century. So there's 3 dots there on that one ring. That's 1900. And if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1904 is actually an extremely narrow ring. This was a big drought year in the Southwest. This is actually from the Four Corners, southwestern Colorado. But 1904 was actually one of the drier years. Up until some of our recent years, we've had, probably that we've had some very dry years right here in the 20th century. The early 21st century. So including the major drought that's going on right now. So I've been reading the news and stuff. Just a kind of a close-up, just to get, again, these definitions here. Again, the early wood and the late wood equals to 1 annual ring. Now notice that the early wood actually is more for sap transport. I'm going to come back to this in a second. The lakewood, and notice the cells, each of those little openings there is one single cell in the wood. And each of those then, they have different functions. The early wood are very open, and it's for this water and nutrient transport from the roots all the way up to the leaves. The late wood, then, notice that the cell walls are a lot thicker, and it's much more for structural integrity for a tree. You know, a tree, you got to get your leaves up in the air to capture the sunlight, of course, as part of photosynthesis. But the wind's knocking you around and everything, so that late wood is going to actually provide more rigidity for the tree. The resin ducts there are actually a lot of the pines and other conifers produce resin as part of their defensive mechanisms. You probably have heard they can actually drown bark beetles in resin, and that protects the tree from bark beetle attack, for one thing. A few other just definitions here of parts of the tree. Of course, the bark is basically it acts like the skin, our skin. It protects this is going to be important, and I'll come back to this with the fires in particular. Phloem then is, so most of wood, of course, is the technical name for wood is what's called xylem. And there's two parts. Sapwood is actually where this water and nutrients from the soils are traveling up the stem because of evaporation of water. And one thing is it's getting these micronutrients, soil micronutrients that are necessary for photosynthesis up from the soil where they are to the leaves where they're needed for the photosynthetic apparatus. So it's a really interesting process. Trees are the only place on the planet where water is flowing uphill, and it's flowing through the sapwood, these little tiny cells in the sapwood. Heartwood now, that brown portion there in the center of the tree, that's actually where just a lot of the waste products of the tree are secreted to. The phloem now is where sugars produced by photosynthesis are actually traveling back down the stem of the tree, all the way out to the tips of the roots. And this is where the sugars are providing the new building blocks for new wood. The cambium is a very, very thin layer of cells and it's using these sugars now to produce new wood, both xylem to the inside and phloem to the outside, and new bark, of course, as well. Just a close-up view again. Basically, these cells are a series of pipes. They're about an inch or so long, 2 or 3 centimeters long. They are open. There's no cytoplasm in the cells. The cells are actually dead, but they're rigid, and they now provide where water is going up the stem. Now, coming to the dendrochronology, our tree ring research, the idea is because climate's controlling the growth of the trees, then the ring patterns are going to match. If our ponderosa pine in the Southwest, in Colorado, they're in Nebraska, these guys are drought sensitive. They're responding to soil moisture. Once they run out of soil moisture, there's little tiny openings in the leaves that shut down, and no more carbon dioxide, no more photosynthesis occurs, and that's it for growth for that particular year. So again, during a drought year, we get a narrow ring. During a wet year, we get a wide ring. Now, this is going to be consistent for all the trees in an area. If there's a dry year for that tree, it's a dry year for this tree over here. They're all going to show more or less the same pattern of rings through time. Now, we have to start with living trees. We don't have to cut down living trees. I'll show you another close-up of this in a minute, but we use what's called an increment borer. It takes about a 1/4 inch diameter core out of the tree. It cuts it cuts a little core out of the tree, this core of wood, and we can pull that out so we can analyze the patterns of the rings going back into time, starting with the present day. So of course, every year the tree's adding on a new layer of growth, a new tree ring. So we have to start with living trees to develop what we call a chronology, these patterns of these ring patterns, these ringlets, and other ring characteristics through time. After we have those living tree chronologies developed, Then we can go to dead wood, old stumps or dead trees. We have no idea when the tree died, but by matching the pattern of those rings with the living tree chronologies, then we can find when that tree grew, other characteristics about that tree, and so on. Now, one of the big applications of dendrochronology over on the left there, of course, has been to date archaeological timbers or timbers from ruins or cabins or things like that. So I've done quite a bit of this as well, where, of course, the archaeologist is interested in is the death date of the tree, when somebody cut that tree down to use in the construction of their village. So in this case, again, what we can do is we can take a core or a cross section. In this case, you can see he's using a saw over there on the left to actually then find the ring patterns, find when that tree was cut down, that timber was cut, and then that gives you a potential age for the construction of that building. So, if you go down to Mesa Verde, for example, in southwestern Colorado, they'll tell you that Spruce Tree House was built between 1224 and 1286 AD. That's from the tree rings. Here's an example of this is me taking an increment core out, and you can see the core of wood there from this tree. The increment borers have been around since the late 1800s. It's a great way of sampling living trees. It doesn't hurt the living tree. They'll grow back over that hole very quickly. But it allows us to get the ring patterns now from living trees. Here's an example of cross dating, just to show you again. Every decade, so the 3 dots there are 1800. But notice, for example, there's 1786 and 89 there. Again, one of these dots is every decade. And you can see 86, 89 on all 4 of these. These are 4 separate trees, actually 2 different species, Douglas fir as well as ponderosa pine, growing about 20 kilometers apart, so 15 miles or so. But you can see that the patterns match, again, because climate is controlling the growth. It's not exact, of course. In some cases, some trees have got a little bit more soil moisture, other trees have got less soil, so they're going to show much more of a response to that dry conditions and so on. But again, this is this process of cross dating, climate controlling the growth, and the ring patterns will match. Now, we have to do this cross dating because what we run into, so for example, in the middle of the ring series here, you can see the early wood, late wood. Each of these is an annual ring. But notice how that one tiny little ring there, and notice there's the resin ducts, those bigger openings there, pinches out at a certain point. In some cases, it's so dry for a particular tree for a particular year, the tree doesn't put on any growth at all or very little growth. So now if we sampled this tree, if we took a core down more towards the bottom of this photograph right here, we would have that little narrow ring, a tiny ring. If we did it more in the middle there, we wouldn't have that ring. We'd have what we call a missing ring for that year. Now, using this process of cross dating, we can account for that in our count and our dating of the ring series. We'll know from other trees that there should be a ring at this particular point. That's actually 2002 right there, which was a very dry year here in the Front Range in Colorado. Here's another example. This is actually that 1904 I mentioned. So the one narrow ring over there is 1899, 1900. Here, I think I can show it. 1899, 1900, 1, 2, 3, and then there's 1904. This very, very tiny ring. Again, very dry year for that for southwestern Colorado. Now, the opposite problem we run into is what we call false rings. So again, we've got the late wood of one year. This is the overwinter portion right here. No growth formed for, and typically in our area, they'll start up in June, 1st of June or so. They'll grow through the summertime. And then what happens, and this is actually from southern Arizona, is it gets really hot and dry in late June. In fact, they're starting up even in May. They're putting on this early wood band, and then it gets really hot and dry in June. The tree starts to shut down growth, but then In normal years, the monsoon rains pick up in July and August. These are, summer thunderstorms and so on. Anybody from the Southwest, and even here in Colorado, we get a lot of monsoon rain. I think you guys do there in Nebraska as well. And the tree starts to put on another layer of growth. So it looks like two rings. And then and then this lakewood right here is the end of the growing season in September. So, and then no growth in the wintertime. So it looks like two rings, but it's 1 year. So this is what we call, again, the false ring. So again, through our cross-dating procedures, we can typically account for this. Just to show you, we can't date tropical trees. More trees that are growing in areas where we have a season of growth, and then it quits for that year. This right here is a map of where we have this International Tree Ring Data Bank is an online repository of tree ring chronologies around the world. And you'll notice there's hardly any chronologies from the tropics. Tropical trees just don't, they're growing all year round, basically. So we can't tell, here's the end of one ring, here's the beginning of the next for an annual ring. Lots from North America, obviously, lots from the southern Andes there. Lots from Eurasia, very few chronologies from Africa. Mainland Australia, almost no chronologies because eucalyptus trees don't work for dendrochronology, and something like 300 species of eucalyptus. But Australia, Tasmania, there's actually a lot, and from New Zealand as well, there's a lot. So many more from the Northern Hemisphere than Southern Hemisphere, obviously. Now, a couple of applications. I mentioned the dating archaeological sites. This is Keat Seal Ruin in northern Arizona. This guy, Alfred E. Douglas, was the sort of the father of tree ring research, and he was actually an astronomer who was looking for, this was in the early 20th century, he was looking for a longer record of sunspots and realized that he could, the thought was, well, climate's affecting tree growth, sunspot activity affects climate. So we can find a record of sunspots, a longer record of sunspots by looking at the tree rings. But quickly the Southwestern archaeologists realized that, well, geez, if we could get, cores out of our timbers from our archaeological sites, Douglas could date these things. And that was his first real, he became famous for dating of Southwestern archaeological sites quite a bit. Now, another application, of course, is reconstructing past climate. So in this case, for example, this is that red line is a whole bunch of trees that we've sampled from southeastern Colorado. And then that blue line are actual weather records, rainfall records. Now, our weather records only go back, to the late 1800s at most. So, in this case, back to about 1904 was the earliest records, reliable records we had from southwestern Colorado. But notice the match between the tree ring growth and then the rainfall patterns. Obviously, the trees are responding. It's not an exact match, but very, very close. Notice here's the 1930s, the Dust Bowl. Obviously, over much of the Great Plains, you can see the very good correspondence between the tree growth and the rainfall records. But now we have much longer tree ring records. Our tree ring records go back into the 1500s from southeastern Colorado. So now we can start, placing the Dust Bowl into that longer term context. This is where this term mega drought has come into play lately as well. So for example, we see longer droughts, particularly in the late 1500s. There was what was called the 1580s mega drought. And it's about 20-year long drought over much of particularly the southwestern US, but the Central Rockies as well. This mega drought shows up. So, this is one question of, this natural variability. We're going back into this droughty period here in the early 21st century. Plus then we have climate change on top of that. So increased temperature in addition to low rainfall patterns. So this gives us just a longer window into understanding the natural variability of our climate systems. Now, what I want to do is also now just go into, I'm sorry, I forgot one other question everybody always has about, what's the oldest trees? Obviously, there's, we're always interested in that. Now, when we look at a big tree like this one, you think, well, it's old, but a lot of it has to do where the tree is growing. So in this case, it's got lots of moisture. If it's growing down in say a creek bottom or something, it's not stressed. So in this case, this tree was only about 220 years old, even though it's that big. Whereas, for example, some of the oldest trees that we've sampled are the bristlecone pines that are growing up in very rocky locations. Notice there's very little soil right there. So in this case, we're dealing with a tree that's probably about the same diameter, the same size as that ponderosa on the left. But this tree is about 1,500 years old. So, it's that much more slow growing. In this case, this is actually, look at this little shrubby. This is a Doug fir from here, just outside Fort Collins, not far. That's tree is 800 years old. Spiked top, very inverted carrot shape. It's growing in the granite rocks. It has very little soil moisture, very stressed environment. One of the terms that we use all the time is longevity under adversity. Unfortunately, it doesn't work for humans that well, I don't think, but it definitely works for trees quite well. So for example, the bristlecone pine, if you've never been to the White Mountains in California, they're right on the California-Nevada border in Eastern California, but gorgeous trees. And, each of these can be over 1,000 years old. Giant sequoia is another one that is, in this case, these are old trees, but these are also in the Sierra Nevada in California. Gorgeous trees. 10, 15, 20 feet in diameter. Nothing like what we have here, in the central part of the continent. But these can get to be up to 3,000 years old. So again, in this case, size does equal to old age. One thing I maintain is actually the old list. It's a database of ancient tree ages. You can Google this if you are interested in it. But Pinus longeva is the Great Basin bristlecone pine. So again, you can see close to 5,000 years old. Fitzroya cupressoides is actually our only southern hemisphere species that gets very old. Alerce is the common name, grows in Chile and Argentina in the Andes. Sequoia dendron giganteum is the giant sequoia, but you can see some of the other ones. Pinus aristata is a Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine, close to 2,500 years old. Sequoia sempervirens is coast redwood. So you can see, again, all of these. The oldest known ponderosa pine down there, if you see that one, Pinus ponderosa, is 929 years old. We don't have ponderosa over 1,000 years old. It's always been surprising to me that we don't have one that old. Now, I want to turn to some of the work that I do quite a bit is looking at past fires. Fires will leave a record in tree ring series in a couple of different ways. I'll get to that in a second. Now, most of the time when we think of fire, we think of this kind of fire. And of course, right now it's in the big news, this very destructive kind of fire. However, in many cases, historically, we had what are called surface fires, where they would burn at the base of the trees and really not take out the entire forest. They take out patches of trees or individual trees, but overall the forest would still survive. This was very, very characteristic of ponderosa pine forests historically. Now, a lot of this, of course, depends upon the type of forest we're dealing with, the elevation of the forest. This is our Front Range forest here from Fort Collins going up to tree line and above tree line at Rocky Mountain National Park. So we have, here in our lower elevation forests are dominated by ponderosa pine. I've done a lot of work in the Black Hills, the Pine Ridge area, a similar situation where they're fairly dry forests, they're fairly productive forests. There's lots of biomass. For a fire ecologist like myself, vegetation equals potential fuel. All that fuel has to do is dry out. It has to dry out enough that it will carry a fire. Of course, we still need an ignition source as well. Now, subalpine forests that are growing right up at tree line, they're very wet forests. They're very productive forests, dense canopies, continuous crowns, but they don't dry out very often. Snowpack lasts a long time into the late spring, early summer. Snow comes quickly in the fall, late summer. So they don't dry out very often. When they do dry out, they tend to be that crown fire. Now, our lower montane forests, the ones dominated by ponderosa pine, historically would dry out fairly often, and they would have enough fuel. Now, this also comes to the type of forest we're dealing with, is to the adaptations of the forest. So, for example, Lodgepole pine, this is Yellowstone National Park after the 1988 fires. Lodgepole pine have what are called serotinous cones. In a ponderosa pine, for example, the cones, the second the seed matures, the cones open up, the seed falls down on the ground. Lodgepole, on the other hand, have what are called these closed cones. The cones don't open up until they're actually heated by fire. They have actually got sort of a waxy covering on them. The seed remains viable in that cone until it's heated by fire. The cone opens up at that point. The forest is killed by this crown fire, but a new generation is able to start right up. So from a tree ring standpoint, we can come into these kinds of forests, look at the ages of the trees in here, and then date that last fire. So again, this is after the 1988 Yellowstone fires. Notice all the dead trees. Those were killed in the 88 fires, but the brand new forest has started up. This is lodgepole pine. Aspen is another one. Aspen sprouts from rootstocks. Sprouting is a great way to come back after a fire. Now, ponderosa, on the other hand, is actually adapted to these surface fires. Notice the surface fuels here. It has thick bark. Fire kills trees in one or two different ways. Either it kills enough of the canopy that the tree can't photosynthesize anymore, enough of the crown, that's the crown fire, or it kills enough of that growing tissue, that cambium. Remember I mentioned the cambium before. Bark is really critical here because bark actually insulates that cambium. It doesn't take much for a fire to kill that cambium. Only about 130 degrees Fahrenheit for about a minute, about enough to cause a third-degree burn on us. But that bark will insulate the cambium. But occasionally what happens, this is what's called a cat face over here on the left. If you guys have wandered around in ponderosa pine forests at all, Black Hills, Pine Ridge area, you'll see these cat faces occasionally. And what's happened here is that fire has killed a portion of the cambium, a portion of that growing tissue, and left a scar, a fire scar in there. Now, if it kills that cambium all the way around the circumference, it will kill it kills the tree at that point. But what's happened here is that it's left this scar, and we can come along. So this is a cat face, a close-up of a cat face. Each of these little ridges is where fire has killed this growing tissue, left this scar. We can come along, take a slice out of that using a chainsaw. We typically do this just on dead trees. And we get these long sequences. Each of these is where fire has killed that cambium, left a scar. This way we can reconstruct the fire history in these forests. So here's what one of these fire histories look like. Each one of these white lines is an individual tree with the red triangles as the fire scars. These are three separate sites, individual trees at three separate sites in the Black Hills, actually, from Wind Cave National Park. We've sampled in the Pine Ridge area. We find the same thing, lots and lots and lots of fire. Notice that there's a great amount of synchrony, both within the stands as well as between stands. So fires burning across large areas in the grasslands, basically. And historically, we know this was, lots of historic references to these as well. Notice the time span going back into the 1400s. Here's even a larger scale. So that last one was individual trees. Now these are individual sites made up of a number of different trees all together and averaged into a single chronology. Going all the way from southern New Mexico there, the Sacramento Mountains, the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico, a bunch of sites we got in the Front Range, and then again a bunch of sites that we collected in the Black Hills. Notice that there's lots and lots and lots of fire. So here's our model for what's going on in the past is we had very open, multi-aged forests. It wasn't an even age forest. That lodgepole pine forest or the aspen I showed you, all of those stems are getting started at the same time. So that's what we call a very even age. They all date to the same time period. In this case, we have trees that are 100 years old right next to trees that are 400 years old. They were maintained by these frequent fires. What would happen in the past is that we would get a pulse of regeneration. Young trees, seedlings would come up, but the fires were burning every 10, 15, 20 years, depending upon the location, depending upon the elevation, but very frequent surface fires. And what would happen, this is actually from the Black Hills. All of these little baby trees, I think there were about, 15,000 trees per hectare right here, seedlings, 10,000 trees per acre that were coming up in this area. And just imagine if all of those start up, this is going to be they're all competing with each other for water, light, nutrients, and so on. But what would happen is that if one of these fires would come along before the trees could grow very big. And the main purpose of these fires was to kill baby trees, the main ecological purpose. So here's a prescribed fire recently that we had down here in southern central Colorado, down in the Pike National Forest. And you can see these fires, they don't kill the overstory trees, the big trees, but they do kill the little trees. Now, occasionally one or two of them would survive and they would become part of that overstory. So we had these very open, multi-structured forests in the past. Lots of understory, grass, forbs at the bases of the trees. You could gallop your horse through the forest at, a full gallop, basically, not run into anything. But notice the 20th century here. So again, notice the time span on these. I forgot to point that out, but going back into the 1400s, notice around 1900, the fires tend to stop. That's because of two factors. First of all, European settlement. These are all in the Western US. Native American populations are getting displaced. They're getting kicked out of traditional landscapes. By the way, a lot of the historic fires were probably set by lightning. I mentioned ignition, but also Native American ignition was a big factor probably. But when European settlement occurs, livestock grazing comes in. These are mainly grass fires, these surface fires. And so livestock grazing is reducing that fine fuel that needed to carry the fires what carried the fires historically. Also, of course, after particularly 1910, we're starting to get active fire suppression by land management agencies, Forest Service in particular. So what's going on there is, okay, we start with this multi-structured forest. We also get a lot of timber harvest, but when we get this pulse of regeneration, now all of those trees can grow up to be part of the canopy. So we've increased that canopy density that now, so for example, we've recently done a study here in central Colorado where we've looked at how many trees were present historically and how many trees are present today. So in this case, those two orangey trees, they were there before 1890, excuse me. And all of those black trees are actually ones that have come up since fire suppression has occurred in this stand. So going from, 15 trees per acre to 150 trees per acre in many cases. This has increased the potential for these, very destructive crown fires to occur. Changes in landscape coverage too. This is from one of the Boulder County open space parks, but you can see the change from the 1911 hillside, much more open. Now in the present day hillside, that's all forest. And again, we just increased the potential for a crown fire to run across that hillside. So we've changed it from these surface fires now to these more destructive crown fires. This is actually from the Jemez Mountains in northern New Mexico. And you can see, what was a forest is now going to be grassland for quite a few years. One problem with ponderosa pine, it's not like the lodgepole pine that it has these serotinous cones. It actually has a fairly big seed that doesn't go far from the parent tree. So when we've lost the seed source across big areas like this is actually from the 2002 Hayman fire. All of these, both of these views here, all of that was ponderosa pine forest before 2002. These are taken about 20 years after, or 15 years after, 16 years after 2002. And you can see there's no regeneration whatsoever. The seedlings you can see in this were actually planted by Denver Water. That reservoir down there is the Cheeseman Reservoir, which is one of the main water sources for the city of Denver. So lots of problems with watershed, erosion into the reservoir and so on. So one of the things is we're trying to get back into this, restore these forests back by thinning them is the big thing. So for example, here's a couple of projects that have occurred here in the Front Range where we've gone in, Forest Service has tried to, restore the structure of these forests, and then using prescribed fire, trying to get fire back into these landscapes. One of the things here, just to point out that these can have an effect. Fort Collins, so this was the recent Cameron Peak fire that occurred just last October here in the Front Range. That big brown blotch you see is actually the High Park fire that occurred in 2012 here in the Front Range. But all of those blue blotches are where the Pike San Isabel, or the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest has set up treatment areas. And here's the footprint of the Cameron Peak fire. Notice that the treatments actually did have an effect up there to the north. Unfortunately, the treatments to the south of the High Park fire, and particularly down towards Estes Park there, had not been completed. And there was a huge run that went all the way out to the grasslands there just outside Fort Collins in Loveland. This was our largest fire on record in Colorado, over 200,000 acres. So, but these treatments can have an effect, and we know they can. Prescribed fire has to be a big part of this. We're trying to do a lot more burning here in the Front Range. These are controlled burns, trying to get fire back into these ecosystems, reducing that fuel loading, restoring the structure as well. So our ultimate goal is to get, again, this is where the tree ring data has really come into play, to provide that historical perspective, contrast it with what we've got present in our landscapes today, and that gives us direction for going into the future. So, and that's my last slide, I believe. I'd welcome any questions. And also, by the way, there's my email address. Rocky Mountain Tree Ring Research, again, is my company. If you have any questions about anything I talked about today, please give me a call. Drop me an email.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us and having that presentation. It was really cool. I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to pull up a poll for everybody to look at while they think of questions for Peter, and then we'll get started on the Q&A as well.
Yeah, and again, in terms of, a lot of our data sets, particularly from places, there's these isolated woodlands out in places like Nebraska So for example, I mean, there's been some researchers there at UNL in particular, this guy Tom Bragg I've worked with quite a bit, and he's using a lot of this information that we've gotten from the tree rings to then justify going out. The big issue, obviously, in your area is the eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, which has invaded a lot. Historically, the grasslands would be maintained by the frequent fires. You turn the fires off, and then all of these junipers can now invade what were historically grassland. So a lot of ranchers are starting to, use fire as a tool to restore these grasslands back to their historical condition. Yeah.
I just wanted to take this time to thank you, Peter, for sharing your knowledge with all of us. And also wanted to thank Laura for being so kind to host. And if you have questions, please, by all means, don't be shy. Go ahead, and I think we might have a couple of questions coming in here. Okay, this question is from Cassandra.
Yeah.
When you're looking at tree rings from archaeological sites, can you also tell what forest or forest location the trees come from?
That's an incredibly interesting question because yes, you can. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon there in northwestern New Mexico is out in the middle of a desert. And yet they built these just tremendously, incredibly intricate ruins, villages. And they used a lot of timbers to make those. And yet there's no trees anywhere around. And that's always been a question of where in the world did these trees come from? They could have come from northeastern Arizona, or they could have come from the Jemez Mountains, they're more in central New Mexico. And so there's been a number of studies to try and source where these trees came from, where the timbers came from. But in general, in places like Mesa Verde, there's ponderosa growing right next to where the ruins were and things like that. So they, or other trees that they use. So pretty local sourcing for that. But yeah, it's a good question because, in some cases, we may have to really explore where they did come from. Yeah.
Thank you. We had another question. Can you see CO2 levels within the tree rings like you can with ice cores?
That's a good question. No, in general, I mean, we can't. People have used, however, what are called stable isotope analyses to look at composition of the atmosphere based upon the tree ring. So for example, carbon has three common isotopes, C12, C13, and C14. C14 being the one that's radioactive and decays. But the ratio between C12 and C13 is pretty interesting because the trees like to pull in the C12 more than they do the C13. And so this gives us an indication of the atmospheric composition. So people can see the impacts of us burning more fossil fuels, and that signature does show up in the tree rings for sure. Also things like people have looked at nitrogen. So for example, pollution from cities, that can show up in the tree rings. Heavy metals, so pollution from industry or something like that will actually show up in tree rings as well. So there's all sorts of neat things that do show up in the trees. And again, the basis for all of this is this cross dating, because we have the exact annual date of each ring through this cross dating process. So we know that, yeah, this is what the CO2 or the stable carbon isotope ratio was of, 1946 versus 1846, that kind of thing.
It's amazing what trees can tell us. We have a question from Patricia, and she asks, what long-term effect does cattle grazing have on the fires, particularly canopy fires? And thank you for the presentation, she said.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of Well, again, I mentioned it's more that surface fires that the cattle grazing has had the impact on, because we see this, that one graph I had, just about anywhere at the time when European settlement takes place, it wasn't the miners digging the gold out of the Black Hills that made the money. It was the ranchers who came in after the miners that were selling them the beef, to make they were the ones who made the best money and stuff. And of course, at that point it was overgrazing, nobody owned the land, that type of thing. So in many cases, we see this cessation of fires very coincidentally with when grazing comes in. So for example, in northern New Mexico, when the Spanish came in earlier, we see the cessation much earlier in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So it's that thing. In terms of the canopy fires, we really don't see, more of the canopy fires, like in the subalpine forests I mentioned, those are much more climate related. They're very much dependent upon having that fuel dry out enough. And one of the things we're seeing, in fact, there was just a study published just the other day that is arguing that we're seeing more fire in the subalpine ecosystems here in the Central Rockies, at least, than we have in the last couple of decades than in the last 2,000 years. And
Wow.
that's being related to climate change. More warming is going to equal to hotter and drier conditions. So get prepared for what, interesting times in coming decades.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that subject, question from Peggy. How does climate change differ from fluctuations in drought, etc., over the years in terms of how it impacts trees?
That's a good question. In many cases, we're seeing, so for example, I've been talking a lot about drought impacting tree growth, and the width of the rings and stuff. But people are really looking at, for example, up at tree line, the trees are responding much more to temperature. The warmer the growing season, the longer the tree has to grow, the more wood it's putting on for, at higher elevations. So people will go up and sample those trees to look at, the past 1,000 years of temperature variations. And sure enough, we're seeing in many cases that the growth is going up because of increased temperature, or at higher latitudes as well. In Canada, for example, or in Russia, at upper tree line, and those trees are definitely doing much better because of warmer temperatures. So there are these sort of more global patterns as well as more local patterns related to, for example, just precipitation and temperature and rainfall patterns. So, but yeah, tree rings have been used quite a bit recently in looking at these, in placing our current climate situation into that longer term perspective. It's one of what's called proxy data sets. Proxy meaning it's the feature of interest, temperature, recorded in a natural archive. So, you mentioned, somebody mentioned the ice core data, looking at past carbon dioxide concentrations. That's a proxy data set, just like tree rings are.
Okay. We have a couple more questions. The first one is on the first slide of your presentation. I think it was the cross section of the tree ring. Why is the left side darker?
In terms of the photograph of the trees, again, the lightness and the darkness of the ring, the early wood, those cells are much bigger, more open, so more holes in them basically. But the darkness of the late wood actually also comes from so most of wood is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, right? Sugars, carbohydrates. But there's also another chemical called lignin that is actually sort of a glue, and that causes that brown coloration of the late wood. And again, that helps with that rigidity, that strengthening of that late wood. So you've got that again, the water, the sap transport going through the early wood, and then that rigidity for structural integrity of the tree in late wood. But yeah, good question.
Okay.
But,
And from Catherine, when examining the rings of a tree stump cut in 2021, do you start counting from the outside in and label ring 2 as 2020?
that's a good question. So, if we had this is from like an increment core. If we cored a tree right now, and again, these little quarter-inch diameter cores, we would probably see the ring for 2021 starting, just, a portion of the growth for 2021. And like I say, what we do is we count backwards from 10. To call a ring 1 or ring 2, ring 3 doesn't really mean much because, okay, we core the tree next year at the same time. Now that outermost ring is going to be ring 2022. So what we do though is we just start counting backwards and we put a dot in every decade. So what we do is, 2021, 2020, we put a dot. And then we go 19, 18, 17, so on, 2010, so on, back to 2000. So that way we can, really keep track of, what I like to do is tell everybody is you kind of get a picture of what the ring should look like in your head. Well, 2013 was a really dry year. 2012 was a really dry year. 2014 was really wet. So, you get this pattern in your head and you start seeing the rings and I always tell everybody when, students I work with, when you start cross dating in your sleep, your dreams, you're a real dendrochronologist at that point. So.
I suppose that's probably true.
It's a lot of fun. I have to say, all of our work is done, to be a good dendrochronologist, not only do you have to know how to count backwards from 10, but you do have to spend a lot of time in the shop as well. So we'll take our cores and we'll put a very, very fine polish on them so we can actually see the cell structure. We do all of the work underneath microscopes. So, we have, I've got my lab right here and, 7 to 20 power microscope. So we can really get down and look at the rings very closely.
Nice. We do have an additional question from Cassandra, and she asks, in dead trees, can you tell in the tree rings when fungi or insects started their infestation of the tree?
Yeah, that's a good question. We, again, anything that's going to affect the growth of the tree, we can potentially find the data of that, in the tree rings. So for example, in the, bark beetles, typically the bark beetles, one of the things that they'll do is they'll actually introduce a fungus, the blue stain fungus, into the tree. And a lot of times they'll kill the tree at that point. But because we can see that blue stain in the sapwood of the tree, we know it was killed by bark beetles. So that gives us an idea of the, of mortality agents and stuff like that. The other thing that happens though is a lot of times, so for example, in those bark beetle outbreaks that we've had recently, people have reconstruct past bark beetle outbreaks because what'll happen is that, not all the trees in the stand are going to get killed, but, most are, but the survivors will actually then, because there's a reduction in competition, they get more light, more water, more nutrients. So they'll do what we call a growth increase. So, the rings will be going along fairly slowly and then all of a sudden they'll speed up. And if we look at enough trees in a stand and we see, all bunches of them speeding up, we can think, that's because of say a bark beetle outbreak and it killed all the neighbors on those trees. So there's all sorts of, and again, there's other things that can kill trees. So was it bark beetles? Was it, fire, so on. So that's where the fun part of being the researcher comes in, is, to tease out these things. But we can certainly see it in the tree rings and we can date the timing of it, the date of it.
Nice. Do we have any additional questions for Peter? Here's your chance to ask the expert.
Hey, drop me an email if you think of ones later as well. So.
And Peter, what was the boat adventure that you went on. I think people might be interested in watching that. That was just so amazing.
Yeah, my other love is the Grand Canyon. And I was telling Laura, I've been trying to do, you can go on and what are called DIY private, you know, you can go on a commercial trip down the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River raft trip, but there's also private trips. There's a lottery system every year people put in for winning the lottery. And I've never won it, but I've gotten enough people. So you can go on raft trips, and I've gone on raft trips now 7 total. But for the last 5 years, I've tried to go. You can only do 1 trip per year, and just while I still can, I mean, I'm getting old, and I'm you know, so I'm trying to do them as long as I can. But this last trip, I actually a friend who's a river historian. Um, he's been very interested in the types of watercraft that people have used over the years. So the first trip down the Grand Canyon, if you know the history, you know, was in 1869. John Wesley Powell, you know, one-armed Civil War hero, started the U.S. Geological Survey and so on. But Powell, you know, was the first leader of the first expedition to go down the Grand Canyon in 1869. But we know that Native Americans, you know, built watercraft. There's a number of legends about, you know, previous trips. You know, the Hopi, the Navajo have these legends, and so the lower Colorado tribes used what are called tule reed rafts. They built these tule. Tule's this giant sedge, very very buoyant. And so my friend Tom Martin, who was the organizer of this trip, had this idea of let's build a tule reed raft and see if it could go down the Grand Canyon. We didn't even know if it was going to float. We had no idea if it was going to be able to survive the rapids. And so Tom recruited me to ride the raft. I thought it was going to be, and it was. We didn't think it was going to last 2 days, and I went all 278 miles. 30 days down the river. That raft was still as buoyant and as structurally intact as the day we launched it.
That's
so
amazing.
We kind of proved that a tule reed raft could have run the Grand Canyon sometime in the past 10,000 years. So yeah, look up Grand Canyon Tule, Tule raft on Google that, and you'll find some videos of it. It was a fun trip, a very fun trip.
Well, okay. Thank you for sharing, Peter.
Thanks for asking.
Amazing. And I don't know, Laura, did you want to close this out? Did you have?
Yeah, we are right at the 7:30 mark, so we're right at closing time for this event. I just wanted to let everybody know that this event was recorded. So if anybody did come in a couple minutes late, it'll be up on our website probably beginning of next week. It's anyconserve.org, correct, Rita?
I think that's right.
Okay, anyconserve.org, and then you'll just find this current event and then also our past events, if any of those catch your fancy. But otherwise, we are all good to go. Thank you again, Peter, for speaking with us today.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, Rita and Laura, for the invitation and the opportunity.
And thank you,
I'll
George.
definitely check out and see what other talks I want to look at. The pollinator one next time sounds fun. So
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Have a nice day, everybody.
Yeah, thank you for joining.
thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.